Hi, yes. My name is Brendan McNally from the UK, from England, and I've been a political activist for my entire adult life. As a young man, when I first left school, I was involved in many campaigns against racism, anti-war, anti-fascism, anti-nuclear campaigns. But eventually I became specialized in animal rights campaigning. And I've been an animal rights campaigner really for the last 30 years now. And over that time I've seen a lot of changes. I've been involved in many aspects of campaigning, and part of that campaigning has brought me into conflict with the forces of law, and I've seen repression against the movement in the UK firsthand. And so what I'm going to do today is I'm going to talk about that, and with a view of giving my experiences, because what's happened in the last maybe 10 years in the United States, and more recently in Austria and in Spain, it's what we saw in the UK in the 80s and the 90s. So what happened to us over those years is what is happening now in Austria and Spain, and will happen to everybody who is successful at campaigning against any form of oppression, that the state will eventually come after you and you will suffer repression. So what I was going to do is start with a short history, a very brief history of how the repression started in the United Kingdom, and how the government fought back, and the various forms that this repression took. So, Jose, help. Hilfa. Thank you. Technology, we never had it nowadays. So we start in the 1960s, and many of you will be aware of the hunt saboteurs, and these were people who took direct action to stop animals being killed by hunters. And this was really the beginning of the modern animal rights movement in the United Kingdom, and eventually through the rest of Europe and the rest of the world. In the 1970s, because the hunt saboteurs faced repression from the police, they faced arrest and repression from the police, and also violence from the hunts. And so some saboteurs decided to take illegal direct action because they were no longer able to take non-violent direct action. And the significance of this is that the first modern activists to use illegal tactics were actually doing so in response to state repression. So the repression actually came first. That's important to remember. The first activists were actually legal, non-violent activists. Then came the repression, and the activists had to go underground in order to be able to continue saving animals' lives. So it's important to bear that in mind. From these small beginnings, in the 1980s, there was a huge upsurge in direct action. And that's when the government responded with repression. There were lots of activists were arrested. There were big conspiracy trials, long prison sentences. And as I said, I was involved around this time, and I served several prison sentences as a result of this. Into the 1990s, I've pressed too many buttons. Okay, so the violence against the activists continue, and 2 young hunt saboteurs are killed while trying to stop hunts. So we've got the violence has become worse and worse against the activists from the animal abuse side. And 2 young hunt saboteurs, Mike Hill, who's 18, and Tom Warby, 15, are 2 young men out, basically activists, non-violent direct action, and they're killed by the hunt. And there are no prosecutions. The government, the police don't take any action against the people who killed the two activists. And instead, the government responds with legislation to try to outlaw the hunt saboteurs themselves. So they introduce a new offence of aggravated trespass. And here we have the first example of laws that are actually brought in, are designed to fight activism. So this is part of the Criminal Justice Act of 1994. So instead of taking action against the hunt, we've now got the government and the police taking action against the victims of the violence. And as I said, this was the first measure aimed at animal rights activists. And as it says underneath, the law failed, the hunt saboteurs continued just as before, and they continue to this day. Just before we move on, it's important to stress that in 2005, 11 years after this, the type of hunting which people were campaigning against was actually made illegal in the United Kingdom. So it's actually now, it's the hunts themselves, what they were doing then is now illegal. So eventually it shows that pressure does actually pay off. Although it's worth pointing out that many hunts they break the law, but at least the law was passed, and so that what Mike Hill and Tom Warby died fighting for, nowadays that pastime is now illegal. So it shows how things change. 11 years after they were killed, it shows that they were on the right side. Oh. So we're coming on to the next. So that was a very, very quick history of repression and from the 60s, 70s, and 80s. You know, I've done this talk before, and that talk itself, just those last 3 slides, I could talk an hour just on that. So, but I've quickly gone through that because it's more important. It's more relevant to talk about the more recent legislation, because that's more relevant to what's happening today to the Austrians and in Spain. So I've quickly gone through the history. So, but if you want to speak about what happened in the 80s and 70s and 60s, I can talk about that later if anybody wants to speak to us. But this is more about the way the government introduced legislation later in the 90s and in the 2000s. And this is what I call repression by the back door. And this is where the government brings in laws which are very popular with the people. The people like these laws. They strike a chord. But hidden within these laws, or these laws are then used against activism, even though the government promised they wouldn't use these laws against activists. And in fact, that's exactly what has happened. And in fact, these laws are used against activists often more than against the people they were supposed to be targeting. So we start with, in 1997, we have the Protection from Harassment Act. And this was a law that was brought in. It's very popular. In the media, there were lots of stories in the media about women who were being targeted by violent ex-husbands, ex-partners, and people wanted to do something. There were some cases where some women were murdered by their ex-boyfriends because they were jealous. And so this was called the anti-stalking law, and stalking is how you describe somebody who won't leave their ex-partner alone. And so it was to stop them being pestered by their ex-partners, and that was the idea behind the law, and it was very popular. When it was brought in, people said, well, won't this law be used by companies to oppress activism? And the government promised that they would never be. They said, no, this will never happen. But in fact, that wasn't true. And in fact, it's been widely used to stop protests. There have been hundreds of injunctions which taken out to limit protests. And under these injunctions, the companies can literally pay for an injunction. And the injunctions have very severe limitations to protest. So, like for instance, outside Huntingdon Life Sciences now, there's an injunction in place. It allows only 1 protest every week to last for 2 hours with no megaphone, and only to last for I think it's 30, I think it's something like 20 people, I think. So, and this is it, and these injunctions are indefinite. So once a company gets an injunction, they keep the injunction. And as long as the company's got enough money, they can just basically buy protection from the courts now. And this was a law that was brought in, remember, to protect women from violent ex-partners. So this is why I've called this part repression by the back door, legislation that's brought in, sneaked in really. And as you see, there are other examples to come, but this is a very good one. And as you see, up to 5 years in prison if you breach the injunction. So if I were to go to Huntingdon Life Sciences today and stand outside, unless it was on a Friday afternoon between 12 o'clock and 3 o'clock, if I did it any other time, I could face 5 years in prison for just protesting outside the animal testing lab, which Andy Stepanian was talking about earlier. More repression by the back door. In 2003, we had the Antisocial Behaviour Act. And again, this was a very popular law. There was lots of stories in the media about gangs of youths, gangs of children, well, teenagers, who were terrorizing housing estates. They were stealing cars and setting fire to buildings, and people wanted something done. There was lots of media frenzy about it. And so this act was to stop antisocial behavior. Again, many activists said, I bet that many activists predicted that this law would be used against activism, and the government once again promised that it wouldn't be used, and they lied again, and that's exactly what it has been used for. The Antisocial Behaviour Act gave sweeping powers to judges to limit freedoms and set conditions. And whereas the Protection from Harassment Act gave companies powers to get injunctions, this law gave judges the freedom to say to impose severe conditions on activists. So, for example, I'm organising a protest on Saturday coming up this week, and I phoned somebody last night and said, "Can you give a speech on Saturday?" And they said, "No, I've got an antisocial behaviour order that stops me using it." He's not allowed to either use or own a megaphone for 3 years, and that's and a judge imposed that on him. Other people can be given antisocial behaviour orders where they're not allowed to protest. They're not allowed to meet any other animal rights activists or any other political activists. It's not just animal rights either. When the Olympic Games were in London in this summer, some activists were given antisocial behaviour orders that they weren't to go anywhere near. I think they had to keep out of London. So again, you know, the law was brought in. They promised it wouldn't be used against activism, and they lied, and it certainly is. Indefinite bans from campaigning. So when the shack, the people from the UK, Andy, who was here speaking before me, he was one of the Shack 7 in America. There were also Shack people in the United Kingdom who were sent to prison as part of the Shack campaign. And 3 of those were released this year. But on their release, they've been given an antisocial behaviour order under this act, and it basically is an indefinite ban on them campaigning. So they are not allowed for the rest of their lives to campaign against animal research. They are taking that to the European Court of Human Rights to try to overturn this ban. But as it stands, they've been released from prison, having served their sentence, but they are banned from life from ever campaigning against animal testing. And again, the Antisocial Behaviour Act also sneaked in amendments to the Public Order Act. And again, we'll come to this in a minute, but what it did was it reduced the number of people needed for an assembly from 20 down to 2. And what that means is the police have special powers under the Public Order Act that prior to this law, there had to be 20 people on a protest, and then the police could impose certain restrictions, which was, you know, they could say you could only be here for a certain length of time, and there can only be a a certain number of you, we restrict your numbers. And this was reduced from 20 down to 2. So basically the same powers now are introduced. If just 2 people meet, then the police can impose conditions. A severe restriction a severe, and again it was sneaked in. Nobody realised this was coming in. Even many campaigners did not realise that this was going to be, this was part of the act. It was very sneakily done. And 2005, we then get the Serious Organised Crime and Police Act. And again, this is only 2 years after the last piece of legislation. This is more legislation. And this one was to stop mafia, organised gangs, organised crime, gangs, arms and drug dealers. That's what the government said it was going to be for. And what they did was, that as part of this act, they sneaked in section 145 and 146. And this makes it an offence to interfere with the contractual relationship between an animal research company and its suppliers. And so what you've got here is, up to 5 years in prison again. So what had previously been minor offences like breach of the peace or trespass, or even not even an offence at all, now was punishable by up to 5 years in prison. But here's the interesting thing, is only against animal researchers. So it's only against anti-vivisection campaigners. And this is a unique example of extremely targeted legislation. And Andy Stepanian was talking about the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act in the United States, and that was a very targeted legislation targeted at animal rights campaigners. Well, this is even more targeted. This is targeted not just at animal rights campaigners, but at just at those opposed to animal research. So you could carry out the same actions against, for example, somebody involved in circuses or the fur trade or farming, factory farming, and you were not guilty. You're only guilty of this offence if it's against vivisection. And this is the most incredible. I've never seen anywhere in the world where such narrow targeting of legislation. And this is what we knew all along. That this was the final piece of proof of what we knew, that it follows pressure from the pharmaceutical industry. And what you have to understand in the United Kingdom is that the pharmaceutical industry is a massive, is a huge supporter of the government. I think it's the 4th biggest industry in the United Kingdom. It's huge. Since the United Kingdom lost all its industrial power, the pharmaceutical and biotechnology sector has become very big. And so all of these laws are basically come about because of pressure from the pharmaceutical industry. And this piece of legislation is really the proof of that, because it only targets vivisection. It doesn't even target, you can do the same actions against the fur trade or circuses and you're not guilty of an offence. You're only guilty of this offence if it's against animal research, which is incredible, really. So then we came on to, this was in 2005, and I've called this one, When is a Campaign Blackmail? Because under pressure from the pharmaceutical industry, the government decides that they're going to take action against the anti-vivisection campaigners. And that, in effect, means SHAC, and another campaign called the SNGP in the UK, but mostly SHAC. And so the government, under pressure from the pharmaceutical industry, this legislation didn't work. SHAC continued to go from strength to strength. So the government decided they had to move against them. And so they need big sentences when they arrest the SHAC activists. And so they ignored all that legislation that I spoke about just then. That was all ignored because those sentences were only 5 years, and they wanted bigger sentences than 5 years. So they instead charged the SHAC campaigners with conspiracy to blackmail. And what that in effect means is that the whole campaign becomes blackmail. So that's why I've called this When is a Campaign Blackmail, because when you undertake a campaign, what you say to a company is, unless you do this, then certain consequences will follow. We will encourage people to boycott your company. And it's a fine line between what's a legitimate campaign and what is blackmail. And so what they tried to do was to criminalize the whole campaign. And the significance is that conspiracy to blackmail is punishable by up to 14 years in prison. And so that's why they decided to use this legislation. And so there were a series of show trials in the United Kingdom, and activists were sentenced, received big prison sentences, up to 12 years, 11 years, 9 years, 8 years. But the Shack campaign continued, and so there was even a second Shack trial a few years later, and there were more big prison sentences. And again, the government decided to use blackmail rather than they brought in legislation to fight against anti-vivisection campaigners, but they decided that they wanted something bigger sentences. So again, they used blackmail. And 2012, which this brings us right up to date, and the Shack campaign is still continuing. But in the last few months, there have been more arrests again, and more people have now been charged with conspiracy to blackmail. The people who took over the campaign after the last series of arrests have now been arrested and charged with conspiracy to blackmail. And significantly, 2 of those arrests have been outside the United Kingdom. 2 people have been arrested in the Netherlands, and they are now facing extradition from the Netherlands to the United Kingdom, which is extraordinary, really, because under the European arrest warrant, this is something everyone else needs to be aware of. That recently, the European arrest warrant was agreed on between the members of the European Union, and under this, it's made it much easier for countries to extradite their own citizens to face crimes in other countries, to face charges in other countries. In this case, what the activists are charged with is not even an offence in Holland, and yet the Dutch activist is going to be extradited to the UK to face trial on an offence that doesn't even exist in their own country. And under the European arrest warrant, they can do that. So you need to be aware of that as well. On that note, the people from Holland did ask me to say that if you could, they're asking for solidarity in effect. So afterwards, if anyone can come to me afterwards, I've got information about the forthcoming Shack trial, because they're wanting support and solidarity, especially with their fight against extradition to the United Kingdom. Okay. Just to finish off on legislation, we also have, on top of all that, they've also got abuse of existing legislation. So abuse of the Bail Act. So what happens here is that as soon as activists are arrested and taken to the police station, they can have restrictions imposed upon them, which again can be things like a curfew, a ban on campaigning, not to contact any of your comrades. Previously, to have any conditions imposed on you in this way, you had to come before a court, and then a few years ago, this changed, and now a police officer can impose these conditions, and you can be released on bail and indefinitely. So that people have been on bail with they've not been charged with any offence, but they've been allowed out on bail with very severe conditions, and these conditions can last for months or years. And again, this is all political. It's all political activists that have faced these conditions. It's an abuse of the Bail Act, because under the Bail Act, unless you've committed an offence, then you are presumed to be innocent, and you should be allowed. They should have to prove it. You're not supposed to keep people on bail for months or years. So that's an abuse of the Bail Act, and that's been used very widely, as if they didn't have enough powers already. Parole. So even once activists who are leaving prison, again, they're facing very severe parole conditions, and they face years of isolation and restrictions. The shack prisoners who've just been released, they have 6 years of parole when they leave prison, and they're not allowed to contact any of their friends. They're not allowed to be involved in any campaigning for 6 years, and this is at a time when they've been in prison for quite a long time already, and they need solidarity and support. And again, this is all with a view to isolating and repressing the activists. And breach of the peace. Again, this is ancient common law powers. Some of these laws go back to the 15th century, but again, under this Breach of the Peace Act, a police officer can arrest anyone if they think that his behaviour is likely to cause a breach of the peace, and that police officer must decide. So it's anything that police officer decides that he thinks that you're going to do something which will breach the peace, then they have total police discretion. So that's just a few of the different, on top of all the legislation, that's just a few of the examples of police powers that are and can be and are used against activists. Okay, so before I come on to the next bit of the what I was going to talk about, that's just a rundown of what's happened to us over the years in the United Kingdom. And again, just to say that it is something that is going to happen elsewhere. I think people from Spain and people from Austria who are here now will recognize some of the things there that are happening to you now. I know that in the Austrian case, police officers from Scotland Yard in London travelled to Austria and were there throughout the Austrian trial and were advising the Austrian government and the Austrian prosecution. So we know that there is collaboration between the state in the United Kingdom and in these countries. So what happens to us here will happen elsewhere if you are successful, I believe. Okay, so we're now going to come on. When I was coming here, there's been some, the people organising this conference asked me to talk about something in particular because we've had, there's one issue in particular in the United Kingdom at the minute which is causing a lot of publicity, and this is the infiltration of the movement from police spies. And again, we know that's happened in the Austrian case as well. Now there have been some examples of that as well, as you'll find out. Quick drink. So I'll start with I'll start with a story, a personal story from my own personal point of view. 2 years ago, in 2010, I was organising a conference, and I wanted to hire some equipment, and so this is the man I contacted, a man called Mark Stone. He was an activist, and he was the person who was in charge of all the equipment, such as marquees and sound equipment that you needed to get from a conference. Among the activist groups around the country, different activist groups, environmental, social justice, this was the person who was in charge of much of the equipment. And so I contacted him, and I was in touch with him, and he wasn't involved in animal rights as such, but when I got in touch with him, he said, he said he had been interested in animal rights and he wanted to get involved. And so he came to the gathering that we had in Italy later that year, and some of you there will have met him there. Just a few weeks after the gathering in Italy, in 2010, activist Mark Stone was actually exposed as an undercover police officer. So the person who I had contacted for all the equipment was actually a police officer. And I had only just met him like 6 months, but he had been involved in activism for 8 years. This is who he really was. And he had, but it gets worse than this. He's a police officer. He's married with 2 children, and he's been posing as an activist for 8 years. But worse than that, while undercover, he had a series of intimate relationships with female activists, including one 6-year relationship. His girlfriend was a very nice person as well. Needs psychological help. She's been with this guy for 6 years. She came to the animal rights gathering in Italy as well. And obviously, as you can imagine, all his friends were shocked, but also, and this person is employed by the government. So this is somebody employed by the government who is doing these things. So, as a result of Mark Kennedy's exposure, there were a string of other revelations of police officers infiltrating protest groups. Oops, spelling mistake. And the National Public Order Intelligence Unit is exposed. And this is the unit that's set up by the police to infiltrate animal rights and other protest groups. And the nine other spies are revealed, so in the last 30 years. This is one of them. Activist Bob Robinson turned out to be, and he infiltrated animal rights groups in the 1980s, and he also had relationships with activists, and he actually fathered a child to one of the female activists. And this child grew up never knowing that his father was a police spy. It's also been alleged recently that this man, as part of his cover, planted an incendiary device in a department store, which caused £300,000 worth of damage. He denies it, but some of the activists involved have said that he was given the incendiary device, and that incendiary device was used. So, do you believe the policeman or the activists? It's up to you. You take your choice. Jim Sutton, anti-road environmental protester, Jim Boyling, turned out to be police officer Jim Sutton. He infiltrated environmental groups in the 1990s, and he had relationships. He actually married one of the activists, and he fathered 2 children to the activists. So this is a shocking development. The official response. The police initially claimed that undercover relationships are very rare, but it actually turned out that out of 9 officers uncovered, 8 of them have had intimate relationships with activists, and at least 2 of those have fathered children with the activists. All male. And so, what you've got there is not a rare occurrence at all. This is actually part of their plan. It's actually routine. 8 out of 9. It's not a rare occurrence at all. It's actually part of their tactic to get information. They've been told to sleep with the activists, to marry them, to have children with them. An investigation was set up, and the senior officer said initially, relationships are never acceptable under any circumstances. So we think, well, they've been found out. However, as usual with governments, they have different attitudes depending on who you speak to. Britain's top police officer later said that these relationships were almost inevitable. So they're already positioning themselves that they're going to make excuses for these police officers. And then the government minister of police, he said that the ban on if police officers were banned from having relationships with the activists, then it would make it easy for the activists to find out who the police officers were. So what he's saying is, we've got to let the police officers sleep with the activists, because otherwise nobody will believe they're activists. So you can see how the government has 3 different responses, and it's slowly turning towards, it's okay for them to do it. In fact, not just is it okay for them to do it, but they need to do it. And so now we know what their real attitude is. It was all part, the sleeping with the activists was actually part of their undercover plan. So 8 women are suing the police for emotional damage that they cause. So there's a big case that's going on at the minute. In fact, the judge is out now. The judge is deciding now whether the case can go ahead, because the government have applied to have this case heard in secret. So that under a very secret part of the government legislation, the government wants this illegal action to be struck out, so that it will be heard in secret. And if the government succeeds, even the women themselves will not know what the process happened. So it will be so secret that only the judge and the lawyers will be able to appeal before this court, and there will be no media, and even the women themselves will never know what happened. And if that's what the government is applying for, and as we speak, the judge is actually out deciding whether this should go ahead or not, whether it should be a public hearing or whether it should be a secret hearing. Oh, there we go. I missed that one. So that was just the end bit. That was about the police infiltration. That was because I know that's been big news in a lot of places, and I just wanted to finish on that note. I've got 10 minutes left, so I've got time for a couple of questions. But just to say that, again, I didn't want to. I don't really like doing these talks because for the same reason that Andy was talking about. I don't like to deter people from being activists. But what I will say is, as an activist, two things is, one is you can't avoid repression. Repression is almost it's an inevitable part of your campaigning. If you're successful, you will face repression. It's something you can't avoid. You can't get around it. You can't go under it. You can't go over it. You've got to go straight through it. And what I found over the years, I've been to prison quite a number of times over the years, and what you will find is that the solidarity is there, and you will get support and you will get help. And also, to put things into context, there are places in the world where people are cruelly tortured and killed and murdered, and I've never suffered that, so I've put that into context. So, and of course, compare it to the animals suffering in the laboratories. So, okay, so that's the end of my talk.